Okay, welcome back to our next lecture. Today we will be specifically discussing business successes and failures, what to do and what not to do with businesses. We're going to look at some case studies of organizations that have done well and ones that have done poorly and what had contributed to their downfall. So let's get this started. So business success, essentially what you have to make a decision on when you're developing your own organization or what you're looking into as far as different companies is what does that mean to you? Does that specifically mean financial, as far as it's highly profitable, heavy revenue? Is it a very high growth organization? Is it someone that's doing very good quality work, a lot of quantity? You'll make the decision on what you deem your company to be successful in and what they're doing, whether it's name recognition or good public relations, etc. But of course, the underlining is that you stay in business and that you maintain profitability so you could keep functioning as an organization, of course. But how you deem success in your organization and your entrepreneurship spirit is completely up to you. So let's get it started with specifically. I like to start on a business success of Rovio Entertainment, or as many of you might know, Angry Birds. The organization was founded back in 2003 by three college students, I believe, out of Sweden. And they came together. They dropped out of school and started this organization, and they started creating applications and different game titles to try to generate an interest and did what they loved, so to speak. Angry Birds itself was released in 2009. It was actually Rovio's 52nd game release, so they actually had 51 failed attempts at, appeasing the public and getting something with traction until then. And it just goes to show the perseverance can definitely be a point of valor when it comes to business. And when you look at their overall success, I mean, as of back in 2015, in July of 2015, it had been downloaded. That specific app has been downloaded more than 3 billion times worldwide. And that's an extravagant amount of traffic to have a certain app on a phone at some point in time. And as of 2015 as well, the revenue was around $173 million, and its growth exponentially over the past few years, especially with the new merchandising and the movie that came out in the past 2 years. And they're looking to do sequels and merchandising and TV shows, etc., etc. The organization started with three college students dropping out of school and starting an organization, and I always like to present that they failed 51 times to produce a adequate and very appeasing game until Angry Birds, which was not a revolutionary game whatsoever. Many of you know it's a very duplicated process. There's been many games that had similar premises in the past, but for some reason, using those pigs and the birds went with the crowd and actually got a lot of traffic and billions of downloads. Just to go to show that perseverance and push through, it can happen, and you never really know what the public is going to rally around. They did have some brief financial and leadership trouble in 2014, which does come with a company that grew as fast as Rovio Entertainment did. But they worked through it, and they're now back in the clear and producing many things hand over fist. All right, so the next one I like to talk about, and many will know this, is of course Tesla. Now, many of you know Tesla as a successful organization that it is today, but not know much of the backlog of what it's taken to get where it is. Tesla originally was founded back in 2003, and it was started with privately invested capital from specific investors giving money on what they thought was a good idea for the electrical engine that they were producing at the time. The company's almost gone bankrupt a few different times, but specifically in 2008, they were almost pretty much like wiped out. They were not producing high profit streams of revenue. The vehicles and the engines they were making were extremely expensive and very, very one-off that people were purchasing them, and they weren't sustainable as far as like building and producing in a large range. They actually didn't even start producing profit until 2013, and that's after, of course, Elon Musk took over for the organization and invested a lot of his own capital and a lot of his personal investors into organization to prop it up to keep it going for as long as it did. And then eventually, once they got their infrastructure, their vehicles got a little more cost effective and they had more variables, they started showing profit in 2013. But there was a lot of investment. I mean, that's a 10-year window of a company struggling to try to find its way. And a lot of people believing and knowing that it's a good idea, but to keep investing into it even though it's not paying off at the moment. And as of course, then revenue back in 2015 is up to 4.4 billion, and it's just grown with them producing now the battery packs, and now they're getting into the excuse me, the solar panels on houses as far as like different shingles and what's going to go on at home. And they're definitely diversifying the organization. And the future looks very, very bright for Tesla now, with a lot more capital to reinvest and diversify their portfolio as opposed to what they were looking at in the early 2000s of potentially going out of business. And so you just never really know, and you always have to persevere. A good idea will eventually take, but sometimes it's not always the right timing. And Tesla found that out. I mean, it took them almost a decade to get where they needed to be. And then the last one I'd like to discuss, of course, is Amazon, the monster that Amazon has become. If you've known Amazon in the past, if you're old enough to, it actually was founded in the like early mid 90s, 1994 exactly, as an online bookstore. That's all they sold. They were pretty much like a book retailer. They sold textbooks and regular variable literature that you could get at a Barnes and Noble or a Borders, which doesn't exist anymore. And those, you had options to buy them online. They didn't really have the e-readers or anything at that point. You just could purchase the books from an online source. They originally went public in 1997 as an online retailer for books, but they did not post a profit until 2001, and that was strategic. The CEO at the time actually came out and said that they were not going to pay out dividends or produce a specific profit until he felt comfortable to do so. He wanted to reinvest in the organization and take it in a different direction than where it was going. And so what they did is they reinvested in infrastructure of their online stability. They focused it on their online retail system. And then in 2001, they started to add third-party sellers and other products. So they saw a diversification need and to open up as a retailer for more than just books. Because honestly, I mean, they probably could have survived or thrived a bit in the book space, but the company as a whole saw the foresight of diversifying to different products and services and didn't see one retailer that sold everything or anything via online. And a lot of larger organizations, like you look at like a Walmart or a Sears or like a larger retailer, they have specific brands that they sell. And a lot of these third-party sellers that are on Amazon are not really well known or not really like really high-end products, but they are very cost effective, they're quality, and they just don't have the marketing or publicity to push out. And Amazon was a good platform for them to get on. So they grew exponentially. And so, I mean, as of right now, about 50% of products sold on Amazon are from third-party sellers. Amazon itself has definitely stepped up their game as far as having warehousing and housing their own products to send this to customers. And that's where you can get Amazon Prime. You can get stuff the same day because they have a delivery structure and a warehousing structure that is produced specifically to give customers their products quicker, to kind of give them more incentive to buy the Amazon-based product as opposed to third-party. But they still have options, and most of us and all of us have purchased things from Amazon and understand that process. And of course, as far as another avenue of revenue stream is, they are one of the most popular advertising networks after Google Ads. Many people purchase ad space on Amazon, whether it's their third-party retailers or other organizations, to aim at clientele. And back in 2015, the revenue was as high as 107 billion, and it keeps growing. They have now, when you look at the granular specs of Amazon, they do have a slew of operational issues. But overall, they're taking the world by storm. And I'm very curious to see how their diversification is going to keep going, because I know now they've purchased Whole Foods, and now they're getting into grocery, which is going to be a whole different spectrum of things. Delivery, grocery, and that type of method failed many times before, but maybe now might be the time that it actually takes with this specific clientele of customer base being okay with online-based purchasing, and people might be more fluent in understanding of the process. But only time will tell, and Amazon has a lot more revenue and profit to experiment with to figure that out. Now, we went over some specific successes, so that way you got to see like how companies saw foresight and made decisions based on what they thought would be the best interest of the organization, and they guessed right. So let's go to the other end of the spectrum and look at companies that made bad decisions and where they ended up. So, of course, the first one and one that's most well known is Blockbuster Video. Many of you might remember Blockbuster Video, even possibly have been in a Blockbuster Video, because the first stores actually opened back in 1985. The company's was around for quite some time. Just under 5 years later from their original opening, they were international, meaning they had stores in the entire world. At one point, they had 4,000 locations in the U.S. and 2,500 locations international. That's almost 7,000 locations over the world, which is a huge franchise. Speculated about 43 million households had memberships to it. I know I had one, my parents had one, I don't even know I'm now, but If you're within age range, you probably have been in one and have had a membership to Blockbuster and had that experience. Now, what ended up killing them specifically, and many of you know like Redbox and Netflix and the streaming services, yes, that's exactly what ended up happening. In 2009, Blockbuster made a specific decision to divest in streaming, like not to go for it, and invested in mail service and more locations. They thought that Netflix's mailing system and having their locations was going to be sustainable for the organization. They did not see the value in streaming. They did try to purchase Netflix a handful of times, and they did not reach that agreement. Netflix did not sell to them, luckily, and they just did not move fast enough for the crowd. So they didn't set up any kiosk locations to go after with Redbox, and they pretty much the streaming services eventually started taking over and having more diverse titles, more newer titles, and more contracts, and they just couldn't handle it. So, I mean, that year that they decided that they were going to go away from streaming, because at that current time they specifically had to deal with DirecTV, where they were offering a on-demand kind of service where you could, stream specific movies through Blockbuster. It was very costly for them and not very much of a rate of return on it. So, with that, they decided to pull out of that system with DirecTV and go back to focus on what they were doing and thought they were doing it well. And then less than a year later, they had to file for bankruptcy because, as you all know now, none of us pretty much rent actual physical materials anymore. Everything is done virtually, whether you do it through your Apple iTunes account, whether you do it through your streaming device, if you have a Roku or some kind of other streaming device that has the different applications on it. None of us cater that service. None of us want to go to a store and actually find a movie or rent something. We just pretty much can just, at the click of a button, rent it and watch it right then and there. And of course, you don't have to worry about late fees or anything like that. And so that's a clear case of not moving along with the technology trends and the consumer trends and going out of business. Now, if you do see a Blockbuster around, I think there's a handful of locations that still in existence, but that's specifically because they're a franchise. And franchises have individual owners. And so technically, they're not affiliated with the organization of Blockbuster. They're just a building and a company called Blockbuster. So the owner doesn't pay franchising fees or anything like that anymore because the company doesn't exist. But that's just that. All right, so we've all seen that go pretty bad. But from a company that had almost 7,000 locations to going bankrupt, it's in less than 10 years, or less than like a 20-year span. That's pretty substantial. And you'll see that more often with technology trends. Now, the next one I like to talk about is Enron. If some of you might not remember Enron or really know the details of it, but Enron was originally founded in 1931 as a coal and power company. They were over time they've bought and assimilated other organizations and other energy sources and financial firms, and they merged into Enron in 1985. And they were a multi-billion-dollar company with many different diversifications as far as like funding and money coming in. In 2000 alone, it posted a revenue of $111 billion, which at that time was a lot of money. I know now billions doesn't seem as much as it used to because we hear that term a lot, but at that point, that was an extravagant and high amount of money. Now, what ended up being Enron's downfall is they grossly lied about their financial health of the organization. Now, Enron was a publicly traded company, and in our past lecture, we discussed that when you're traded in a public setting, you have to be fair and honest on your number dealings. Everything that you present to the public has to be accurate and detailed specifically. You can't lie or falsify documents on your financial records, and that's specifically what they were doing, which is illegal and highly unethical. Now, what ended up happening over time is they falsified the financial records to confuse the investors using verbiage or number crunching that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And with all honesty, investors don't go through that with a fine-tooth comb. I mean, you're looking at like 200 pages of financial documentation and growth factors. Like you and me, we're not really going to understand that 100%, nor are we going to sit there and go through all of it. But they were confusing the investors while taking huge losses and hemorrhaging money on stupid expenditures. There was rumors that executives were purchasing helicopters and extravagant vacations, solid gold shower curtains, just random things that were not needed for the organization. They were taking the entire leadership staff on extravagant vacations and putting it on the tab of the organization, just hemorrhaging huge amounts of money. And then from that 2000, they were posted a revenue of $111 billion. In 2001, they filed for bankruptcy once this was discovered that their financial records were falsified and not kept up to par. So just in a single year, their stock price went from $90 a share, which is a substantially strong company, to 90 cents in a single year. So if you were an investor in that organization, you lost pretty much everything in a single year if you kept with them. And by far it was one of the worst bankruptcy cases in the entire U.S. history, because when you have a case of an organization falsifying documentation and records, it gives the shareholders and investors a leg up to sue and try to recoup some of the losses of their financials. Now, most likely they're not going to, but it gives clout to try. And so they had to deal with that. They had to settle out their different stocks and bonds that they offered to their shareholders and investors that they had. They also had to they were prosecuting people for making bad decisions and falsifying documentations. And then, of course, a company of that size also has to go through a third-party screening process. So the banking organization and accounting firms that were looking over the numbers were not doing their due diligence to find these falsified and grossly distested numbers. And so there was a huge issue that they had to work through. And a bigger one even happened later on called WorldCom, if you're familiar with that, but a similar case. And now it's become a little bit more prevalent that the FCC and specific entities have become a little bit more stringent on looking through records and not being so, I guess, cavalier with with just trusting these organizations and what they're doing. But this specifically points out that making unethical choices, especially with financial health, will eventually be your downfall. They thrived for a bit of time with that, but once it was discovered, the company went down and out that quickly. And if you were working for the organization, you were pretty much blacklisted, and you were not going to be able to get another job after that. So it ruined a lot of people's lives, along with making a lot of people poor, so to speak, as far as losing all the money they might have had invested in their organization. So the next one I'd like to talk about that you might not know about is Kodak. I personally am from Rochester, New York, which is where George Eastman founded Kodak back in 1888. His house is actually still there. It's a landmark of my city. The city is definitely not what it used to be ever since Kodak has pretty much gone under. Now, I want to give you a snapshot of this because in 1976, because like I say, Kodak has been around since the late 1800s. But in 1976 specifically, it accounted for 90% of film and camera sales worldwide, meaning they pretty much owned camera and film. Like that was it. That day, there was nowhere you could go that you did not see Kodak somewhere. Whether it was for film, whether it was for cameras, they owned that market. Now, their profits peaked in 1996 at $16 billion. Now, in the 90s, that was ungodly amounts of finance to come in for organizations, especially selling cameras and film. But they were it. They were end all be all of film. They were for pretty much almost a century. Now, what ended up happening is, I mean, most of you know now we don't really use film. Nobody has actual dark rooms or actually develops film anymore. And cameras have significantly changed as well. Nobody even really has a camera anymore unless you're doing specific filming, editing, or you have some high-end pictures you're going to be taking, or you do it for a living. Most of us just use our phones or any digital device that we have. But as you all have seen in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a push for digital cameras and digital images as opposed to the traditional film that we've all become accustomed to, or like Polaroids or disposable cameras that you can have film developed. And what ended up happening is they did not adopt to the digital age. They stuck their ways that film was going to be the way that they did it. They've been doing it for 100 years. They're not going to just adapt and make changes on a whim. And what ended up happening is you had other Japanese-based electronic companies starting to come out with new digital cameras and digital film sets. So what they did is Kodak had to scramble. So in the early 2000s, they adopted the digital structure, and they also were able to gain back up into a second spot of the digital camera sales. But for every camera they were selling, they were losing $60 on every camera sale because they didn't have the infrastructure built for it, nor did they have the contracts and the vendor structure to satisfy selling that amount of money and building those cameras and actually getting them outpost in a costly manner. So in order to maintain their sales numbers, they had to take a loss on every single camera they were selling. And now it's digital, so they weren't selling film anymore. So there's no like, I guess, added repercussions to buying a camera. Like you didn't need setup or film or additional things to make your camera work better. Everything was done through electronics now. And then what ended up happening is less than 10 years later at that kind of structure, they went bankrupt. In 2012, they filed for bankruptcy. They came back a year later, but they're a shadow of what they were. They still sell specific items like print, like certain kinds of paper and film editing software and things like that, but they're a shadow of what they were. I mean, they're not going to be selling 90% of film and cameras in the world ever again. And that's another choice of technology, like not seeing the market trends or not understanding what was going to be happening and sticking to their ways of what they thought was going to be. and ended up going down. So the key focus on this lecture is I want you guys to take away that you make decisions that can really affect your organization. No decision is small in retrospect. I mean, they said, well, they don't thought this digital age, this digital camera thing would just be a fluke or a niche market, and they didn't adopt to it, or it was going to be years before it become prevalent, and they missed the mark. And before they know it, 10 years later, they're bankrupt. I mean, a company that was like the top of the food chain when it comes to film and cameras, literally went out of business, so to speak. And now they're still nipping around, but they're not what they used to be. The whole city of Rochester thrived on Kodak. I had family members and cousins and friends and family that all worked for the organization. The city of Rochester was thriving because of this company. And then once it went down, the whole city went down as well. And jobs, I mean, they employed thousands of people. In a company of that size, just ruined a city that quickly. Same thing happened similar to when you look at the Detroit car markets as well. But anyway, I just wanted to showcase and tell you guys and emphasize very hardly, because in this class you're essentially becoming a CEO and an entrepreneur, and you'll make decisions based on your organization, that you have to see forward. You have to make decisions based on a 15, 20-year process and thought. You can't make decisions on month to month. You can't think of what's going to happen next year. You have to look at what you see your market and your customer base trending to, and you have to make a decision based on that. Not adopting technology will always hurt you in the end. I mean, now we become a very evolving generation and society of wanting technology, wanting easy use. So embrace it and go for it. And that concludes our specific lecture on successes and failures. But I want you guys to take into account that you can look at companies that have thrived and have failed, and you make decisions based on it and go from there. Thank you for your time.